to spread that around either.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Kelly Burke, and I'm the coordinator of campus ministry here at Campion College. And we're not even here. Make sure our mic's on. It's not amplifying much. I wonder if it's switched on. Okay, are we now amplified? Excellent, good. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kelly Burke, and I'm the coordinator of campus ministry here at Campion College, and we're very excited to have you. Now, to formally welcome you, we have Father Sammy Helawa, who is the president of Campion College.
This is how I look now without this. Good evening, and a warm welcome to Campion College at the University of Regina. I'm Sammy Helawa, the president and Jesuit priest at this college, which is the only Jesuit undergraduate college in Canada since 1917. Campion is a federated college in liberal studies, including Catholic studies, among other things. The motto of this college is Substantia Regina, which means wisdom as queen. Wisdom really clarifies and builds on what is true. Our mission, which is the care of the whole person, also comes with that wisdom. And I want to quote Campion, the man in history, the saint, the scholar, who had a very interesting statement, which I always love to quote whenever I speak of him. He said, between optimism and pessimism, there's always confidence in God. And I really like it, because it really gives you the third option, which is the middle way, the reality. And the works of Jesuits in general is a work of reconciliation, both as summary and the goal of their apostolic work, including education. Now, the churches are entering into, liturgically speaking, into the Christian unity, the hopes, and to come closer, to work together, to acknowledge Christ as the cornerstone for all of us. But also to remember that ecumenism is a means for unity as well. Soon the guest speaker will be introduced. But first, let's acknowledge the territorial land of Campion College. We're situated here on Treaty 4 with the presence Treaty 6. This is the ancestral territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and the Nakota people, and the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. With this in mind, a hearty welcome to Campion College.
Thank you.
And now I'll invite Catherine Wood up, who is the Executive Director for the Prairie Centre for Ecumenism in Saskatoon, to introduce our speaker.
Good evening, and welcome to the Margerie Lecture Series on Christian Reconciliation and Unity. This series of lectures, which began in 2012, are dedicated to Father Bernard de Margerie, a priest of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Saskatoon. Father de Margerie has been a leader in ecumenism in Western Canada since his time as a young curate. In 1959, the newly ordained young priest heard Pope John XXIII's announcement of Vatican II as a personal charge. He sought permission from his bishop to study ecumenical theology at the Anglican in Rome, where he lived through the days of the council. On his return to Saskatoon, he resumed his parish ministry, but also began to establish some close relationships with leaders of other churches. Together, they built a vibrant ecumenical community in Saskatchewan. In 1984, Father Bernard established the Centre for Ecumenism as an ecumenical office of the Roman Catholic Diocese. However, from the start, it had an interchurch board and mandate. By 1988, the Centre had matured to the point of formally becoming an ecumenically sponsored centre, eventually representing 7 denominations. It is one of only 2 centres in Canada, and it is unique in its focus on local parish ecumenism and ecumenical formation. The lecture series was started in partnership with the St. Thomas More College Chair in Catholic Studies. The goal of the series is to bring to Saskatchewan innovative thinkers and practitioners in ecumenism from across Canada, the US, and the world. Held within the annual week of prayer for Christian unity, the series remains rooted in the great impulse of the ecumenical movement to pray for the unity of Christ's disciples, that all may be one. This year, we are excited to welcome Campion College and the Archdiocese of Regina as co-sponsors as we hold dual lectures in Regina and Saskatoon. Thank you to Father Sammy, the Jesuit Fathers, and the faculty of Campion College for welcoming us here. Special thanks to Kelly, campus minister at Campion, who has graciously assumed many of the local arrangements. And thank you to you all for joining us tonight. Our 2023 de Margerie lecturer this year is the Right Reverend Bruce Myers. Bruce has been the Bishop of Quebec since 2017. Raised on a farm in Glengarry County, Ontario, he studied at the University of Toronto before a decade as a parliamentarian correspondent in Ottawa and Quebec City. He completed his theological studies at McGill University, Montreal Diocesan Theological College, Boise Ecumenical Institute, and the University of Geneva. He has recently completed a Doctor of Ministry at St. Paul University in Ottawa. He is a professed member of the Order of the Good Shepherd, an international community of Anglicans who share a common rule of life. Before election as bishop, he served parishes in Quebec City and the Magdalen Islands, and as a coordinator for ecumenical and interfaith relations for the Anglican Church of Canada. Bishop Bruce has been a member of the Anglican Roman Catholic Dialogue of Canada, both as staff and more recently as bishop co-chair. Under his leadership, the dialogue is studying theologies of apology with particular attention to the various church apologies to Indigenous peoples. During the papal visit to Canada, Bishop Bruce hosted a survivor of residential schools from the Archdiocese and his daughter, along with Archbishop Don in his own home in Quebec City. It was a tremendous gesture of hospitality, greatly appreciated. It was also a sign of blessing to have him speak here this evening. Welcome, Bishop Bruce.
Thank you. Well, it's a blessing for me to be with you this evening here in Regina and to have the honor of delivering the de Margerie lectures, the first plural, and the first to offer a lecture here in Regina. I haven't seen much of Regina, just the bit that was visible from the plane descending over the airport at dusk when I arrived this evening. So I look forward to seeing a little more of your beautiful capital city over the next few days. I am not from the prairies, as the introduction made clear, or any prairie. I grew up in a valley, specifically the Ottawa Valley, and more specifically still the Lower Ottawa Valley. And these distinctions can be important where I come from. It stretches along the Ottawa River, which is what you call it if you're on the Ontario side of the border, or la Rivière des Outaouais if you're on the Quebec side of the border, or the Kitchissibee, as the Anishinaabe Algonquin people knew it before the arrival of French and British colonists. That part of the valley meanders from around the cities of Ottawa on the Ontario side and Gatineau on the Quebec side, and then continues to flow east until it meets and then flows into the mighty St. Lawrence just before Montreal, and then the whole thing continues its journey east until it eventually turns into the Gulf of St. Lawrence and flows into the Atlantic Ocean. Rivers, indeed all natural formations, carry stories. And one of the stories carried by the river known as the Ottawa, Outaouais, Kitchissibee, is about log drivers. Now, log drivers aren't a thing anymore, but for a large part of the 19th and 20th centuries, they were a common sight in various waterways in Canada and elsewhere, including the Ottawa River. And their job was to guide downriver large booms of logs, timber, that had been felled in nearby forests, and to get that timber to the sawmill or pulp and paper mill located far downstream, and to forestall or break up any log jams along the way. And they would do so with little more than long pikes and spikes on the bottom of their boots, and they would hop from log to log. And it was hazardous work, and injury and death were not uncommon. But the relatively massive paychecks enticed many men from communities all over the valley to take their chances on the river. One of those communities is the one I came from, Glengarry, County Ontario, where especially in the 1800s, young men would leave their family farms for part of the year and find their way to logging camps in forests along the Ottawa River, and eventually find themselves driving logs on the river itself. A somewhat romanticized view of that life is recounted in a novel published in 1901 called The Man from Glengarry, part of a series written by a Presbyterian turned United Church minister who went by the pen name of Ralph Connor. If you've never read Ralph Connor, but you're a Canadian or have lived here of a certain age, you may have seen something called the Log Driver's Waltz. Good. Which you'll know is one of those wonderful National Film Board animated shorts that filled empty airtime on CBC television in the 1980s and 90s. set to a song of the, some people are humming it already. So it's that song, not written by, but performed most famously by Kate and Anna McGarrigle, the McGarrigle sisters. And it recounts the story of a young woman who, much to the chagrin of her parents and various suitors, falls for a local log driver, in part because his skill at navigating timbers on the river makes him a really great dancing partner. Now, by now you may be wondering why a lecture on ecumenism has so far made no mention of Christian unity and is instead focused on an obscure, quaint blue-collar job from the country's distant industrial past. And it's a fair question, so here's an attempt at an answer. A good deal of my more intensive reflections about ecumenism in recent years has taken place in Ottawa, not far from that storied river, where I was a Doctor of Ministry candidate at St. Paul University, another Roman Catholic institution of higher learning with a long and deep ecumenical movement and commitment that includes having an Anglican studies program embedded in the Faculty of Theology for more than 40 years now. And when I began that research 10 years ago, I finished the research, I finished the degree, so it did get done. But I started it a decade ago, and I was serving in that role that was mentioned of ecumenical officer for the Anglican Church of Canada. And in that role, I was daily confronted with the challenges of ecumenical reception, which I'll say a little more about in a moment. Perhaps more than any other person in my denomination, I became acutely aware of the gap that exists between our church's official commitment to ecumenical engagement on the one hand and the lived out reality, especially locally, on the other. And although I only served in that role for a few years, it was enough time to appreciate the limited extent to which the fruits of many of our church's various ecumenical dialogues, which have often offered not just solid theology, but very practical suggestions on how that can be lived out, have been received at the congregational or regional level. Awareness of our ecumenical agreements and their implications, even among theologically trained clergy, seemed low. I detected a pressing need to foster a higher awareness and a better integration into our church's life of existing ecumenical agreements, perhaps even before attempting to negotiate any new interchurch accords. And that's when I started thinking about that lad on the river, as the song goes. Rather than add more timbers to an existing logjam of ecumenical agreed statements, there's a growing recognition that ecumenists in the current context may need to be less like lumberjacks, those toiling in the forests downing trees, than log drivers, those who deftly guide the fresh-cut logs downriver. Log drivers are equipped with the skills to help dislodge current agreed statements and nimbly navigate them through sometimes choppy waters so that they can be received and processed by the churches and become an integral part of their lives and structures. The finest cut of timber is only of so much use if it's stuck in a bottleneck up the river. What the analogy attempts to point to is that idea of reception. Whether freshly cut pine timber or a carefully crafted agreed statement on ecclesiology, say, to be effective, the good in question needs to come into the possession of its intended recipient in such a way that it is translated into something tangible. A supporting beam, if we're talking about lumber, a mutual recognition of ministry, if we're talking ecumenical agreements. Increasingly, my research and my firsthand experience as an ecumenical officer led me to conclude that a significant part of this logjam is situated in the seminaries and theological colleges, where a large proportion of our church's priests and pastors and ministers are formed. I've therefore come to understand a significant part of my role to be that of an agent of ecumenical reception, an ecumenical log driver, if you will. Such a role was perhaps obvious during my time as the Anglican Church of Canada's ecumenical officer. That's what I was paid to do, and the job was in the title. However, when in 2015 I was called to serve as a bishop, this particular vocation to unity simply took on a different form. A bishop is, or is at least supposed to be, a focus and agent of unity, both within their own particular church and the wider ecclesia. At my episcopal ordination, among the solemn promises I made was to promote peace and reconciliation in the church and to strive for the visible unity of Christ's church. Therefore, even though I changed orders, locations, and ministries midway through my formal research, my vocation to unity remained fundamentally unchanged. And I still ended up in a city next to a big river that was no stranger to log drivers, except in the Quebec City region, they're known as draveurs. So what's all this ecumenical log driving supposed to be in the service of? In the temporary or contemporary Canadian context, the need for a more visible and tangible unity among the churches is as acute as ever. The secular age, which the historic mainline churches in Canada inhabit, has generally resulted in consistently declining membership and diminishing financial resources. So the ecumenical imperative remains, from at least a few standpoints. From a practical standpoint, the failure by churches to engage ecumenically results in an inefficient division and duplication of resources. From a public witness standpoint, divided churches failing to be in dialogue and common mission with each other compromises their credibility in the eyes of our neighbors. From a pluralistic standpoint, fruitful and peaceful dialogue with the increasing number of adherents of other religions present in Canada is complicated by the Christian church's incapacity to speak with one voice. From a theological standpoint, ecumenism is nothing less than a gospel imperative. Jesus himself, having exhorted his followers to eschew their divisions for the sake of his reconciling mission, that they may all be one. Now, for this crowd, at least, here in this lecture hall, and those who may be watching online, I'm assuming these are pretty much mom and apple pie propositions I've just articulated. And who's going to disagree with Jesus and his dying wish that his disciples be one? And indeed, most of the churches to which we belong, which I'm guessing are represented in those present or those viewing online, have long affirmed their ecumenical bona fides in different ways and at different times. My denomination's national expression has long upheld ecumenical collaboration as an ideal, at least twice officially committing the Anglican Church of Canada to what I sometimes call the ecumenical movement's prime directive, the Lund principle, which exhorts churches to act together in all matters except those in which deep differences of conviction compel them to act separately. The General Synod, the Anglican Church of Canada's highest governing body, reaffirmed its commitment to ecumenical engagement through its adoption in 2004 of a little-known declaration called Towards a Renewed Ecumenical Strategy. Among other things, it states that Canadian Anglicans believe they are called to encourage and equip all in the church to walk the way of ecumenism, so that all will come to know the hope for the restoration of the full visible unity of Christ's church. Still more importantly, the 2010 General Synod stated that to be leaders in ecumenical actions was to be one of our church's top priorities in the decade that was to follow. One way this commitment has been expressed is through formal church-to-church dialogues. The Anglican Church of Canada is, or up until recently has been, in official conversations with the Roman Catholic Church, the United Church of Canada, Mennonite Church Canada, and the Moravian Church, and years of similar talks with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada and its antecedents resulted in the establishment of a relationship of full communion between the two churches in 2001. And that doesn't take into account the broader ecumenical relationships our church has through roundtables such as the Canadian Council of Churches, Kairos, and the World Council of Churches. However, for all the official ecumenical affirmations or agreements made by the national level of the Anglican Church of Canada, or any church, they're only effective if they're received and lived into by the more local expressions of the church. It more often seems as if many churches live out what you might call the anti-Lund principle, acting separately in all matters except those in which we are really compelled to work together. Now, I don't think most churches do this because of any kind of animus or ill will or suspicion toward people of other churches. I suspect, and have experienced firsthand, that it's mostly just inertia. We have become so accustomed to and so comfortable in our divisions and have really known nothing but our divisions that we no longer consider them particularly scandalous, if we ever did. And we've not sufficiently developed our ecumenical reflexes to the point that it becomes second nature to ask, what other church or churches, which other ecumenical partners can we do this with? Whether this is something to do with mission, evangelism, outreach, teaching, peacemaking, advocacy, public witness, even a building project, rather than going it alone, which tends to be our default. There's also a tendency in churches, when we're facing what we perceive to be a time of scarcity or crisis, to turn inward in ourselves. We sometimes talk about circling the wagons, rather than looking outside of ourselves to see what gifts and possibilities are to be discovered in our neighbors. It's remarkable how often leaders, lay and ordained, of different churches commiserate together about the similarities of the challenges we face as communities of faith, and the conversation ends there, rather than taking the next step toward talking about how our churches might try and face those challenges together, and possibly even see them as a moment of ecumenical opportunity. I'll say a little more about that in the next lecture. And there's so much we can already do together. The ultimate vision before us is of a church fully reconciled, gathered around one Eucharistic table, sent out as one body into the world God so loves. That's God's gift and God's goal for God's church. But in the same way we don't sit around doing nothing waiting for the consummation of God's kingdom, neither can we remain idle in our denominational silos, waiting for the church to be made visibly one again when Christ comes again. Just as we join with God in manifesting the kingdom of heaven on earth one small piece at a time, here and now, we can also reveal the unity of the church one small piece at a time, here and now. There are many examples of what those small pieces can look like. One place to look for some is a document some of you will be familiar with, especially if Archbishop Don Bolin has been a part of your life at any point in the last few years, and that's a document called Growing Together in Unity and Mission. Published in 2007, it's the foundational document of the International Anglican Roman Catholic Commission on Unity and Mission, IARCM. Established in 2001 following a formal meeting of Anglican and Roman Catholic bishops held a year earlier in Mississauga, Ontario, convened by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the President of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, IARCM's mandate is to promote our relationship by seeking to translate our manifest agreement in faith into common life and mission. In their introduction to the document, the Commission's Anglican and Catholic co-chairs describe it as not just another ecumenical document for discussion and reflection and study, but rather nothing less than a call for action. The little book's divided into two sections. The first summarizes what it calls the two communions' manifest agreement in faith, harvesting the fruits of 4 decades of official theological dialogue between Anglicans and Catholics on the Trinity, ecclesiology, Scripture, sacraments, ministry, authority, discipleship, and the Virgin Mary. And then the document consciously makes the turn from cataloging theological agreement to outlining its concrete implications for the dialogue partners. It asks that all-important question, well, we've got all this great theological concordance, so what? And it makes this turn with a particular sense of urgency. Genuine faith is more than assent, the document says. It is expressed in action. And how that action can be expressed is in Section 2. It's a cornucopia of practical suggestions on what our churches and all their expressions can do to translate this manifest agreement into common life and mission. 34 practical suggestions on everything from joint catechesis to common prayer, collaborative evangelism to partnership in diaconia and public witness. But I hasten to add that while this is an Anglican Roman Catholic bilateral document, many, if not most, of the suggestions for joint life and work can be adapted and applied to most any ecumenical partnership. And in fact, that's part of what the ecumenical movement has revealed, is the degree of unity that is to be found across all Christian traditions. There's a particular emphasis in the document on activities connected to baptism, such as joint baptismal preparation, joint commemorations of baptism, joint renewals of baptismal promises, and the development of common baptismal certificates. And this is maybe unsurprising given the Second Vatican Council's emphasis on baptism as the sacramental bond that binds all Christians together despite ecclesial divisions. There's also an emphasis on ecumenical common prayer and joint study of the Bible, shared outreach to marginalized members of our society. In sum, it's a set of suggested practices giving detailed expression to the Lund principle. Churches doing all things together, but those things which deep differences oblige them to do apart. I think many of you will, if not know personally, will have read Tom Ryan, who's still a great ecumenist with a mission and ministry in North America. He observed once that if the churches earnestly applied the Lund principle in their daily life and work, there would not be that many things that we would have to do separately. The list would actually be very short of those things that deep difference oblige us to do apart. A priestly colleague of mine once recounted to me that she had trouble getting the clergy from other denominations in her part of the diocese interested in doing anything ecumenically. All of them served multi-point parishes and pastoral charges, which I know are familiar to you on the prairies, just as they are in rural Quebec. Everyone's just tired of being stretched so thinly between many communities, she said, and I don't blame them, my colleagues in the other churches, for not wanting to take on another project. Which which I thought was a very telling way of framing ecumenism. What if instead of seeing ecumenical engagement as another kind of project, another piece of programmatic work coming out of the synod office or church house or your executive minister, what if we saw it as instead an entire framework for how we carry out ministry in our communities, as a way of being as opposed to some kind of add-on? It's not about making every priest or pastor or minister an ecumenical expert, but rather about helping them develop an ecumenical consciousness they can carry with them into every aspect of their ministerial vocation. As the current Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, has said, ecumenism is not an extra thing one can fit in because it's an interesting occupation. It's the oxygen of mission and evangelism. It's a wonderful way of framing it. It's the air we breathe as we engage in God's work in the world. Now, despite the fact that Growing Together in Unity and Mission, this wonderful document, the fact that it's been out there for about 15 years now and enjoys some level of official approbation by both the Catholic Church and the Anglican Communion, it's still a relatively undiscovered treasure. For instance, a survey of more than 200 Canadian Anglican clergy conducted as a part of my research revealed that only about 20% had encountered Growing Together in Unity and Mission. I mentioned that statistic to a colleague, and they thought that was actually pretty good. And that colleague pushed back and said, the problem with Canadian ecumenists is we set the bar very high because of the degree that the ecumenical movement has found traction in this land in a way that it hasn't in others. I was hoping for more than 20%. And I tend to see that as an indication of where an ecumenical logjam might be located in our seminaries, in our theological college, as our other centers of ministerial formation. And I wish to be clear that ecumenical formation is for the whole people of God. It's not only for the ordained. This isn't an argument for clericalism at all. Ecumenical formation's objective is that all Christians be animated by the ecumenical spirit, whatever their particular task or mission in the world. But in many of our traditions, the general faith formation of the laity, especially in congregational settings, is normally the responsibility of the community's ordained leader, if it is a tradition that includes an ordained group of people set aside for ministry. And typically those people have received an especially intensive theological and pastoral education. They're what missiologist Stephen Bevins calls the trained theologian of the community, which I think is helpful because I think the communities consist of all sorts of theologians. Just some have received a little more formal training than others. And so if the laity under a pastor's care are to be formed ecumenically, well, it follows that the pastors themselves receive adequate ecumenical formation. Call it trickle-down ecumenics, if you will. Kevin Flynn, who some of you will know, was for many years the director of Anglican Studies at St. Paul University in Ottawa, and as a result has helped form dozens of present-day pastors. He put it this way: if the results of ecumenical dialogue are to be received by the churches, leaders present and future will play a key role in the process. Not only must they be able to inspire interest and assist their people in understanding agreed statements, they must also know in their own experience the value of such theology and its applicability to the real pastoral challenges before them. Now, most of my church's seminaries or theological colleges have ecumenically diverse faculty and student bodies, or form a part of a larger grouping of non-Anglican institutions that provide that variety. And while there's unanimity that ecumenical formation is an essential element for individuals preparing for ordained ministry, something else my research revealed was that only one of all of the Anglican centers for ministerial formation across Canada has a mandatory course in ecumenism. For its Master of Divinity students or equivalent. A few others offer an optional course. And ecumenical documents like agreed statements are only occasionally included in course reading lists. And it was interesting to note that the ones that are relatively dated. Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry, BEM, is an amazing document, but it's 41 years old, and it's been built on ever since. And the legacy of BEM continues to inform much of our ecclesial lives, but other work's been done since. Like the churches they're preparing clergy for, these institutions face significant challenges around money, staff, and the expectations of their various stakeholders around curriculum and learning outcomes. So it's perhaps not surprising that as enthusiasm for ecumenism has waned in the churches over the past few decades, ecumenism's place in the formation of future priests, pastors, ministers, and teaching elders has waned as well. It's sometimes argued that something like a dedicated core course on ecumenism isn't necessary because other courses like systematic theology, church history, or theological ethics will include a ecumenical dimension to them, or that those courses are taught by an instructor who comes from another church tradition. And while looking at different theological disciplines through the lenses of other Christian traditions is indeed an essential task of ministerial ecumenical formation, it's still no substitute for an intentional and focused exploration of the ecumenical movement itself. Mitzi Buddy, who's one of the few dedicated teachers of ecumenics in North America, she teaches at Virginia Theological Seminary in the States, has made the observation that while divinity students are often taught the history of the church's divisions, heresies, schisms, and contemporary denominationalism, it's a part of every survey course in church history, the Reformation, the Great Schism, everything that's happened since. Rarely are they instructed in the ecumenical movement's decades of efforts to try and reconcile and heal these breaches in church unity. The result, Professor Buddy says, is we re-inculcate the divisions of the church into every successive generation. We only tell half of the story, leaving out what I would argue is the best and most hopeful part of the story. In doing so, we risk robbing our future clergy and the communities they serve of the knowledge and tools to themselves become agents of reconciliation in their churches and beyond. As any teacher will tell you, even the best curriculum is no guarantee that learning goals will be met. There's a lot more involved, and in my lecture in Saskatoon tomorrow, I'll discuss, among other things, what some of the extracurricular ecumenical dimensions of ministerial formation look like, and their potential to be transformative not only for students, but for the whole church. Ecumenists have long lamented that the fate of many hard-won and painstakingly crafted ecumenical agreed statements is to sit on shelves gathering dust, or to get stuck upriver in a logjam. What would it look like if we used our pikes and spiked boots to help dislodge some of these accords, draw them to the attention of a new generation of ordained leaders, and let them flow downriver so that they can be received, processed, and integrated into the lives of our local Christian communities. And what is the potential cost of not doing this? One practical outcome is that as theological colleges and seminaries have lost the will and or capacity to privilege ecumenical formation, a generation of clergy are now serving in positions of leadership in the churches with little or no exposure to the ecumenical movement, its principles, imperatives, or to the theology, worship, and adherence of other ecclesial traditions. A generation of what one scholar calls ecumenically illiterate clergy. In its 2005 report, the joint working group between the Catholic Church and the World Council of Churches lamented, back in 2005, that a new generation of Christians is sometimes unaware of the way things were and how much things have changed in the decades since the founding of the WCC and since the Second Vatican Council. This is no mere expression of ecumenical nostalgia. The words of that report express a legitimate anxiety shared by many in the movement that a failure to adequately educate the faithful about the way things were risks a return to that time in which fear, ignorance, mistrust, suspicion, stereotypes, caricatures, recrimination, anathematization, even persecution characterize the relations between the divided churches. And if this sounds alarmist, just look at what's happening in the wider world right now and how we didn't think the kind of retrograde retrenchment into old prejudices and caricatures and nationalisms was possible in the political realm, for example. I would argue that's a warning for the churches as well. Even if the movement toward the restoration of the full visible unity of the church is taking much longer than first hoped during the heyday of the ecumenical movement in the last century, the progress made in promoting healing and rapprochement between separated churches and separated Christians is nevertheless remarkable. That gift and achievement is at risk, however, and could give way to a retrenchment back into denominationalism, including in the realm of ministerial formation. A WCC study observed not long ago that the single most remarkable trend in world Christianity is that the degree of denominational fragmentation in the international and regional landscape of theological education networks and institutions is as high as never before in the history of Christianity. And this is witnessed by some of these ecumenical federations and consortia and organic mergers were starting to decouple, and standalone denominational institutions were becoming normative again. Among the byproducts of this renewed denominational fragmentation and retrenchment are ethnocentrism, fundamentalism, and religiously sanctioned nationalism. And in a world increasingly gripped by nationalism, regional conflicts with international dimensions, mass migration, xenophobia, climate change, global inflation, and the still unfolding consequences of a planet-wide pandemic, the Church's visible and tangible witness is compromised more than ever by its disunity. The former General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, Olav Fikse-Tveit, and now a bishop in the Church of Norway, once put it this way. He was riffing off of Archbishop Desmond Tutu's assertion that apartheid was too big for the divided churches of South Africa to challenge individually. General Secretary Tveit said, "The needs of a world for reconciliation with God, with one another, and with nature are too big for a divided church." I'm regularly reminded that these are not abstract theological aspirations. And one such recent occasion was just this past Christmas Eve, when I celebrated the Eucharist in a relatively remote fishing community of about 400 people in eastern Quebec, where there are no resident clergy. Haven't been for years. A Roman Catholic priest also flew into the village to celebrate Mass. The Anglicans gathered at 7 p.m. and the Roman Catholics at 10:30 p.m. in separate church buildings a short walk from each other. Because of the number of interchurch marriages in the community, several people, including myself, attended both Eucharistic celebrations. As I was walking up to the Catholic Church, the person walking a few steps in front of me turned around to see who it was. And squinting and not recognizing me, because a visitor in a community that small tends to stand out, he asked me who I was. "My name is Bruce," I said. "I'm the Anglican bishop." And he momentarily froze, only blinking in what appeared to be incomprehension. "Really?" he asked. "Yep." And I pulled down my scarf so he could see my collar for whatever proof that could offer. And I explained that the Anglicans had already had their Christmas service a little earlier in the evening, so I was coming to join our Catholic neighbors for theirs, and would that be all right? And after a brief moment, he smiled and said, "You know, there was a time when something like this would have ended up in a fist fight." And he was being perfectly serious. Maybe not in his memory, he was relatively young, but the divisions in some of these communities run long and deep. And I smiled back and said, "Well, thankfully those days are long, long behind us." And we walked into the church together, and after what appeared to be a great deal of happy hubbub between priest and congregation, I was enthusiastically invited to vest, proclaim the gospel, preach the sermon, celebrate Mass, and pronounce the blessing. It was deeply touching, and I told the priest how deeply honored I was to be invited, and what a witness that invitation in itself was. I also said I didn't want to get him into trouble. But I nevertheless, I couldn't get out of being seated beside him behind the altar, and I proclaimed the gospel, and we offered the final blessing together. As Anglicans and Roman Catholics, that holy night in that little village of 400 people, we read the same lectionary texts, preached the same gospel, sang the same hymns, used essentially the same Eucharistic prayer. We even wore the same vestments, but separately, at different times, in different venues, around different altars. Those two Eucharistic celebrations of the incarnation of our Lord were simultaneously and paradoxically testaments to both the Church's fundamental unity and its scandalous division. Testimonies that the ecumenical movement has come so far and still has so much further to go. Thank you. So, there's time to ask questions, and I'm afraid that's only open to those who are physically present. in the hall. So apologies to any folks who may have joined online. But I'm guessing anyone who's watching this online knows how to reach me by email or other means. So if you have questions, feel free to get in touch. And we'll just pass the microphone around, and I'll do my best to answer.
Thank you. Well, my name is John Dean. I belong to St. Joseph's Parish in Balgony. I probably started to get, excuse me, hopefully you'll allow a story and then a question and a statement.
For sure.
Oh, thank you. I began to get interested in this whole topic about 20 years ago. I was at my uncle's funeral in Invermay, Saskatchewan. My Uncle David and Aunt Doreen belonged to the United Church. And at that service, the minister had in his hand a piece of paper, and he said, on this piece of paper are the list of 5 questions that David's life has not answered. I remember one of them. The other 4 I don't remember. But the one I remember was, if we all read the same Bible and we believe in the same God, why are there so many different churches? So the minister of the day couldn't answer, didn't try to answer the question, but he did kind of touch what you offered, and that is, wouldn't it have been wonderful that we as Christians would be all together to worship the same God and read the same words? Wouldn't it be wonderful? So that was my kickstart, if you will, if in interest. We live now in a society that is becoming very secular, materialistic, and pleasure-seeking. And that probably started to take root in the 1960s, at least in terms of my lifespan. It would seem that this is an opportune time for the churches to be together and to begin and maybe be a bit tough in describing how the church's messages to people, to society, has some of the answers to the issues around, the high suicide rates, the high divorce rates, the corporate corruption, the government corruption, drug overdoses, all the things we see that are becoming so depressing for everybody. Is there any model that is being thought about or considered that can begin to bravely offer, I guess it'd be too naive to say solutions, but to begin to offer things to think about around these topics? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. That's excellent. Well, I'd say there's all sorts of models out there, and there have been for a long time. So I mentioned just one of those documents, Growing Together in Unity and Mission. There's 30 plus suggestions on various versions of what you're describing. And it's not, okay, we're going to structurally unite and merge these different congregations, although that may eventually be one of the outworkings of that kind of collaboration. But here's the things we can already do together based on the degree of unity in the faith that we've already established. And that's why I really like that document, because for anyone who's asking, well, do we really agree on things like the authority of Scripture, on the Eucharist, on the Blessed Virgin Mary, and then the concordance between, in this case, Anglicans and Catholics is actually laid out, and it has the imprimatur, to some extent, of both the churches. And then the next section is, and here's what this can look like. So why can't you have Bible studies together instead of separately? If we read the same Bibles, and if in a lot of cases we're using the same lectionary texts on Sunday, why can't we gather around the Word together? If we really do believe that there's one baptism and we recognize the fullness of that sacrament rightly administered in each of our churches, why can't we do at least some baptismal preparation together, or preparation for confirmation? It gets a little trickier there because of the different ages sometimes. And then you get, and the prairies have been pioneers in this idea of ecumenical shared ministries, where you actually have local congregations of different traditions coming together in all sorts of different ways, and sometimes as a single ecumenical congregation that shares a single building and a single worship service and a single pastor who straddles all of those traditions. I think what you were alluding to towards the end was, and this is a kind of a hint at what I'll be talking about more tomorrow in Saskatoon, is I suspect what you're describing, the current circumstances of the world and our church's shrinkage, at least numerically and in terms of capacity of different kinds, will perhaps be finally what it takes to work more closely together. A colleague that I'm going to quote tomorrow describes it as the marriage of ecumenism and desperation, which sounds kind of, and I've said this in the past, it's like, you know, it's not the most inspiring. When I have congregations sometimes say, okay, I guess I've been trying to get them to talk about ecumenical shared ministries for years, and it's like, okay, we're all poor enough now, we'll talk about it. And wouldn't it be great if when everyone's prosperous and working out of a place of abundance that they see the value in working ecumenically and collaboratively? But I think the Holy Spirit can work through our moments of what we perceive to be moments and times of scarcity too. And if that's what it takes to bring people together and find that unity that they weren't able to otherwise recognize, then that's okay too.
So is there an issue, though, of mistrust or not knowing each other?
Mm-hmm.
That
Yep.
makes what we're describing and hoping for a
Yep.
high hill.
So, and that's part of what I'll be talking about tomorrow, is that whole idea of getting to know each other and how those are necessary steps in getting to that place where the knowing leads to building the trust that's necessary to establish those kinds of relationships. So something I hear often when I try to talk to certain congregations about entering into an ecumenical shared ministry with whether it's the United Church folks next door or the Presbyterian folks next door, it's, well, what about the Book of Common Prayer? The prayer book, the BCP. And that's a whole conversation about what it means to both honor and value something that's of your own tradition, but also recognizing that there's some things that may need to be let go for the sake of a wider unity. Because if we do, because the United Church folks will probably have to, well, maybe they'll be asked to participate in the Eucharist more often than they're accustomed to, and the Presbyterians too. So it's this idea of give and take and compromise that's made easier when these bonds of trust exist already. But the irony I experience in a lot of these communities is these folks are married to each other, multi-generations, they work together, they farm together, they fish together, but the last division in the community is ecclesial, and they still go to those separate buildings. Jean-Marie Thiard described that. I think this picture all the time in Mahone Bay, Nova Scotia. There's this lovely picture. It was on everybody's church calendar has it once every few years. It's a Lutheran, Anglican, and United Church, gorgeous buildings right beside each other on the bay, picturesque. It's gorgeous, but I always remember that quote from Jean-Marie Thiard, Canadian Dominican ecumenist, who says, all these different spires that stand in our communities are scandalous testimonies to our lack of solidarity with each other as Christians. And so from an aesthetic standpoint, they're beautiful and quaint and charming, but from an ecclesial standpoint, they're monuments to division.
Thank you, Bishop Bruce, for this excellent presentation. It's hard to disagree with much of what you said, but you just touched on something that I have experienced and I also struggle with. Yes, there is a need for us to recognize what we have in common, but that stands in tension with people saying, but we have to know our tradition. our people no longer know our tradition. And when you look at the wider world, where boundaries are collapsing and particular identities are being dissolved institutionally, there is a real fear in our churches that we forget our own heritage. And some clergy decide to focus on that rather than, you know, going beyond and forge. And I have experienced that as a pastor myself. I mean, it takes two to tango.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm willing to enter into an ecumenical relationship with my fellow colleagues, but the other person is not there, what do we do? So can you say a bit more about the tension that we feel between, you know, the importance to cherish what our tradition has to offer, and yet to be open to a broader understanding?
Yeah. Well, I don't think the goal of ecumenism is to come up with some kind of mushy lowest common denominator of Christian traditions. And this was one of the early criticisms of the World Council of Churches. You're trying to create some kind of one world superchurch that's going to water down the distinctiveness of each of these unique Christian traditions for the sake of unity being an end unto itself, which is not the goal of the WCC, and they go to great pains to make that. It's a recognition, as I'll talk a little bit more tomorrow, you know, what ecumenical reception is this recognition by one church of the full and complete churchiness or ecclesiality of the other, your ministry, your sacraments, the gospel you proclaim, and the ministries that you exercise. And it's not about you becoming more like us, although in the encounter you will be changed. And that's the risk that comes with dialogue and encounter with the other. It's not the goal necessarily, but it's often one of the outcomes. I think Anglicans in Canada in the last 20 plus years have been deeply influenced and to some degree changed by our full communion relationship with the Evangelical Lutheran Church, and vice versa. Some people find that exciting, some people find it very threatening on both sides, so there's not a consensus. I think it's a both and. So when I was an ecumenical officer and I was trying to find people to serve on our bilateral dialogues with other churches, one of the criteria I realized was really important was you need to have a really good rooting and understanding of Anglican Christianity, because you're going to need to make an account of that to your Catholic, United, Reformed, Mennonite, Lutheran ecumenical partner and be coherent about it. We don't want people who are just looking for a compromise, but that can speak out of their tradition and vice versa. So it's a tension that exists for sure, but you know, the example I was using about, well, you might not be able to use the prayer book every Sunday. And an example like that, it's not necessarily creating a fused ecumenical liturgy, but it's about, you know, we talk more and more about the ecumenical gift exchange, and so seeking the gifts that exist in other traditions and receiving them, especially as we may not have them. So I think it's both. I don't think being an ecumenically conscious Anglican priest, for example, means neglecting your Anglicanism or not knowing your tradition or honoring it. I think that's been my experience, is I'm a better Anglican Christian in dealing with people from other traditions, because I really have to know when they're asking me, it's like, so why do Anglicans believe that? The other thing I'd say is I don't think we're nearly as good forming our own people, clergy and lay in our own traditions, as we think we are either. So that I would argue that as well, that I think we're making assumptions about how well we form our own people. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for saying what you just said. I think the job ahead for people in paid ministry or retired people who were in paid ministry is absolutely huge for anybody under the age of 45. Please go for a walk through the cafeteria here or over at one of the other places on this campus and find somebody who can tell anything about their particular tradition as it came through way back when maybe they got baptized. And what they know about their tradition, should it be Anglican or Roman Catholic, would be, I watched the Queen's funeral, or I have a whole bunch of stereotypes from TV shows about what goes on with priests and congregants. I mean, Father Brown had it together, right, on PBS? I think it may need a major new tack, or it might be easier than we thought. But the question remains, is there going to be a generation to pick up and move on as the church from anybody born after Vatican II, which I celebrate, incidentally. I was trained through that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I keep changing my mind about what I might comment because I'm just so interested in listening to everybody's different comments. But one of the things that I was thinking about was that fear factor of the struggling churches, struggling congregations in particular, thinking in local settings, and the struggle that then makes us afraid to do something with our partner with that sort of either sense of loss of identity, or if we were to do that together, well, we'd have to do it in one place. We can't go over there because then maybe we'll lose our church, and that sort of fear that keeps us apart. And one of the things that I find exciting is when we find opportunities to work together in ways that don't seem to make us afraid. And I just want to share one example, and I wonder if you have other examples. Here in Regina, a little over a year ago, a number of clergy started talking to one another about the homelessness crisis that we had happening in our city. There was a tent city that everyone here knows about. And we started having conversations about, we need to do something. What can we do? What would help? And it led to a decision that we wanted to try offering a meal at a time when there seemed to be a gap in the meals that were provided for people. And it was a thing that we thought maybe we could do, but sitting around the table, we went, our few little churches can't do that regularly, like every week. Like, so how can we do that? So we just started, we tried it out, and then we invited other churches, could you come and help us? We chose one location in one church, and everyone kind of went, it's okay that it's at one church, it's at the Baptist church, they have a good spot, it works well for people to come to. And churches across the spectrum, and not just of the mainline Protestant and Catholic churches, but evangelicals, all different parts of the city, they've all pitched in, and we haven't missed a Saturday since we started. And it's a little thing, really, but it's been, I think, a blessing, a good thing that's happened together, and it's felt very good in terms of the churches working together. And I wonder if you have other examples that could inspire us as well.
Well, no specific examples, but I think the way that's been framed is inspiring for a number of reasons. So, you know, a few things about the example Amanda gave. The initiative wasn't, let's do an ecumenical initiative. It's, we're going to feed hungry people in our city because there's a need. And so we're called to do this. Jesus tells us to do this, that in feeding the hungry, we're feeding him. And then your instinct was that place of scarcity that most of our churches these days start from. Oh, we don't have people, don't have money. But you gave it a try anyway and thought, who can we try this with? So Tom Ryan talks about this in one of his books. He said it's okay, he's not original to this, but when he talks about ecumenical initiatives, like, it's okay to fail. It's okay to try something and it doesn't work, you know. There's no loss, so you had one or two suppers and you couldn't sustain it, but some people were fed and you determined what your capacities were, and it gives you the space. to try something else. Mary Jo Letty, who was the founder of Romero House in Toronto, a refugee ministry, sometimes likes to say, start before you're ready. Because that's always a challenge for me, because I like having everything lined up, and I kick so much stuff down the road, because like, we're not ready yet, we don't have the right people, enough money, the right resources. But start, and then you can tweak along the way. It's okay. And there was one other piece of that I thought was commendable, but it's escaping me. But well, and you described it as small, but that was part of what I was reflecting on before. It's like, it's a big need, and that's how, it's a cliche, all sorts of little small gestures of good can collectively affect important and meaningful change. So it's all about those small things. That's the other point I was going to suggest, was the way you framed it at the beginning, the fear. So it's always best if your first conversation with your ecumenical neighbors isn't, we're dying and you're dying. How can we work together in our moment of desperation? Because it's in having encounters like that ahead of time, you know each other because you've fed the hungry together, or you've been in advocacy for vulnerable people together, or whatever, and you build those relationships of trust, such that when you get to a point where, what do you think about deepening that partnership in different ways? I mean, I've seen how that's worked with the full communion relationship between Anglicans and Lutherans over 20 years. At the beginning, there wasn't a lot going on. We signed the Waterloo Declaration. It was very exciting, but it's not like the next day all these Anglicans started going to Lutheran congregations and vice versa, and we started swapping pastors and founding, joint parishes all over the country. It took years as bonds of trust were established, and it was a very organic kind of movement and building of trust and relationships, a lot of which were based on personal relationships, which I'll talk a bit about tomorrow too. So yeah, there's no small thing. Father Sammy.
Thank you so much for the lovely talk, and you made me think a lot. I used to live with a Jesuit who was an ecumenist. His name is Jerry Hughes. He was the author of God of Surprises, and he told me the future of Christianity is ecumenism. You cannot be a Christian without being an ecumenist, which made me really think a lot. But you said something today that really made me think about the Eastern Church in Ukraine, the Orthodox Church, and the Russian Orthodox Church. They were under one epoch. Now, at Christmas time, the Orthodox Ukrainian decided to follow the Western Christmas date rather than the Eastern because of the war. That's an example, perhaps, or a challenge for all of us now. If we are called to be an arbitrator for that region between the two Orthodox churches, which is supposed to be one, where do we start? Mm-hmm. How do we start? I'm thinking. Mm-hmm. I'm not asking for you to give me an answer, but I'm thinking about it. But perhaps this is something that we, even though we are not in these two churches now, but it is the future of Christianity too, ecumenically speaking. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Well, this example you give in Ukraine isn't the first example in history of a church riven in two because of war and different expressions of the same church finding itself on different sides of a conflict. I suspect, I know you weren't asking for an answer, but I suspect it would, at least primarily at this point, be a matter for the Orthodox to resolve among themselves. But it's not easy. Any other questions or comments? And I think there's a chance afterward for less formal, not that this was terribly formal, but to chat over a cookie and a cup of something. All right, thank you.
Yes, the cookie part won't be recorded.
Yes, you can ask the questions you really want to ask over cookies.
So thank you, Bishop Myers. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you for your vocation to unity, which you have lived beyond your research and beyond your role to live it fully and to witness that. And we need more witnesses of that. As you were speaking about how are we forming leaders to call us to that vocation of unity. And I was just going to say, this is my 5th province along the way, though I did begin in the prairies as well. But my experience in studying at the Toronto School of Theology, I was at Regis College, but I had the opportunity to be part of ecumenical dialogue and ecumenical courses. And yeah, it was definitely a little bit of a, here's an option you can sort of take on the side. But I was really delighted to be among the likes of Lois Wilson, Michael Peers, Margaret O'Gara, and just wonderful folks kind of out there leading the way. And so just to be able to have those opportunities. And so thank you for your talk today and being able to give us a bit of the history and dialogue, but especially for inviting us to move into action and to risk moving beyond the talk and to get out there on the river. I was wondering where you're going to go with the ecumenical log drivers. So and really, I think I introduced the log drivers waltz to a couple of people this week. I must admit, but I know that you have stirred in us this movement to action in this vocation of unity, and I'm excited for your talk tomorrow. So I'll be there on YouTube.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.